Hello everyone. Razorblade Mango here. And today I wanted to just explore my thoughts on a film that I saw very recently that I haven't been able to stop thinking about since I saw it. It's not only one of the most highly anticipated films from my point of view, but I believe it is one of the most highly anticipated films in the world, which is Hayao Miyazaki, if you don't know who Hayao Miyazaki is at this point, I mean, what are you doing? His latest film, which is called The Boy and the Heron, as it's titled in the West, it's called How Do You Live in Japan? So for the purposes of this video, I'm going to be calling it The Boy and the Heron. That's how it is here in the States, so there you go. So I saw The Boy and the Heron a few days ago at the time of recording this, and I wanted to just get my thoughts out in the open because this is a film that has been stuck to the forefront of my mind and refuses to let go. Not only because of how visually memorable it is. I mean, it's got all the usual Ghibli hallmarks and strengths with its amazing world-class animation. This movie has maybe the best animation I've ever seen in their catalog of films. I think it's like up there with Ponyo and Princess Mononoke as some of the best animation I've ever seen. Same with Spirited Away. I think the score by Joe Hisaishi is wonderful. It's up to his caliber of, legendary skill and talent. I think even the dub that I saw it in, the English dub, I think is great. I think a lot of the actors really understand the weight of the film that they are in. I think everybody does a great job, especially Robert Pattinson, who is unrecognizable, which was shocking when I found out who he was playing in the film. This is going to sound strange, where I actually don't recommend watching this video if you haven't seen The Boy and the Heron, because I am going to be talking about specifics. And I wanted to just include that little blurb in the beginning about, what I thought of the film. I think it's a good film. I like it very much. But while I do have issues with it, I mainly want to talk about my interpretation of it. And this is why I said maybe don't watch this if you haven't seen Boy and the Heron yet. Come back to this video once you've seen it and let me know your thoughts on what the fuck is going on in this movie. This is by far Miyazaki's most open-ended, enigmatic thing, a surreal thing he's ever made. He's made some films that have, crossed the line into ambiguity at times. I think when I think about it, Porco Rosso and My Neighbor Totoro are the movies that I come to the forefront of my mind when I think about movies that it took me a while to get. I feel like I'm going to need more time to process The Boy and the Heron. This is the video is part of this process, because I've been trying to make sense of The Boy and the Heron and come up with my own interpretation of it. And I must say at the forefront that after the much more realistic and grounded The Wind Rises, it's a treat to see another Miyazaki film that is a much more potent and unfiltered dose of his signature style of fantasy. And I think that The Boy and the Heron is this surreal, visually dazzling, and at times surprisingly dark odyssey into Miyazaki's own headspace at the time of its creation. However, for all the hype that The Boy and the Heron has rightfully generated, I think a lot of longtime fans will be left scratching their heads about it and even outright rejecting it. And I don't think those are invalid reactions. I was even surprised by my own reaction to it. My gut reaction as the credits rolled was I was fascinated by it, but I was kind of bewildered by what was going on. And even the people around me in the theater seemed to not really know what to make of it. I don't think anybody clapped at the end of it. I think everybody just kind of looked around and was like, okay, that was something. And it wasn't until the next morning after I saw it, when I had more time to process what I had seen the night before, did I start to find some kind of meaning in such an enigmatic film. And I went into this movie respecting Miyazaki's wishes to not look up what it's about. Don't look up any kind of interpretations or don't even look at any footage of the movie. So I going into this movie, I didn't see any clips. I didn't see any trailers. I didn't even know what the hell this movie was about besides the very basic premise that G-Kids, who's the American distributor of the movie, put out. I was kind of left like, oh, that's what this movie is about? Like, this is what it's like? And I think with The Boy and the Heron, there are intentionally a lot of interpretations you can attach to the film. I think it's even been said that Miyazaki himself is kind of like, I don't know what the fuck this movie is about. It's very open to interpretation. And I think there are a lot of them you could attach to it. I think you can make the case that it's a film about Miyazaki pondering and accepting his inevitable death. You could make a case that it's a film about his relationship with his mom and the memories of his childhood experiences during World War II that still haunt him to this day. He's been very open about that. You can make a case that the film is about his friendship with Suzuki, who's his longtime producer, and the late great Isao Takahata, who was one of his closest friends and one of his next to Suzuki, probably his closest working companion for many, many years. However, the one interpretation that has sunk its claws into my mind and refuses to let go is that I think The Boy and the Heron is about the end of Studio Ghibli itself. There's a documentary that came out in 2013 that I think is great. I think it's very insightful. It's called The Kingdom of Dreams and Madness. And it's a documentary about the dual making of Miyazaki's last final film, in quotes, The Wind Rises, and Takahata's actual final film, The Tale of the Princess Kaguya. One of the most interesting sequences in that film for me is where Miyazaki ponders the end of Studio Ghibli. And there's a point where the interviewer asks him, quote, "Aren't you worried about the studio's future?" And Miyazaki responds with, and this is a direct quote from the documentary, "The future is clear. It's going to fall apart. I can already see it. What's the use worrying? It's inevitable. Ghibli is just a random name I got from an airplane. It's only a name." End quote. So when reading this answer without visual and audio context, it sounds like a dismissive answer that's pretty typical for the famously grumpy filmmaker. However, when hearing this answer and seeing Miyazaki's face when he says it, you realize that it isn't meant to be dismissive or grumpy at all. It's said with a smile on his face, relaxed body language, and a carefree and accepting tone. He knows Studio Ghibli is reaching the end of the road, and he's more than okay with that. And I think The Boy and the Heron represents this dignified acceptance more than a decade after he said this stuff. All of Miyazaki's films contain parts of his, obvious parts of his political ideology, his thoughts on social issues like environmentalism, his thoughts on traditional Japanese customs and how they're fading away over the years, his own childhood experiences. But I think The Boy and the Heron is the first time he has ever directly inserted himself into the film as an obvious proxy. One of the most important characters in The Boy and the Heron is named Grand Uncle, and he is the master and caretaker of the dreamlike world that the protagonist Mahito finds himself in. And I think the dream world itself represents Studio Ghibli and its legacy. And I think that's obvious considering there are quite a few visual homages to Miyazaki's past work in this dream world. There are obvious elements of Princess Mononoke, Spirited Away, Howl's Moving Castle, Castle in the Sky. So when Mahito meets Grand Uncle for the first time in a dream sequence within the dream world, surprisingly enough, it's revealed why he and his other blood relatives have been drawn to this place. And that's to take up the mantle of the master and caretaker of the world. And Grand Uncle explains to Mahito that through some pact with an unseen and powerful figure, he can only pass on his duties to a blood relative. And Mahito is one of his candidates, along with Mahito's pregnant stepmother and a much younger fire-wielding version of Mahito's biological mother named Himi, who's dead in Mahito's world by this point in the story. And this whole thing about succession sounds oddly familiar. It's no secret that Studio Ghibli has struggled to find a successor to carry on the mantle once Miyazaki retires. Like, legit actually retires. One strong contender years ago was Yoshifumi Kondo, who was the director of the wonderful Whisper of the Heart, but he died very suddenly back in 1998 of an aneurysm. Another contender was Hiromasa Yonebayashi, but he left Ghibli to form Studio Ponoc. And the most obvious recent possible successor was Goro Miyazaki, the long-suffering eldest son of Hayao Miyazaki. However, it's been reported that he passed on the opportunity to succeed his father. And if I'm being brutally honest, I think that's a good thing. I mean, have you guys seen Earwig and the Witch? Jesus Christ. At this stage of the game, no one is left to carry on Studio Ghibli's name. But you know what? I think Miyazaki is fine with that. And he expresses that sense of peace of mind through The Boy and the Heron. And that's why I think the film also serves as a direct message to his son Goro that he accepts him for who he is and is okay with, him living his life away from the trials and tribulations of managing and continuing his legacy. And I think all this comes to a head in a climactic scene at the end of the film during a confrontation between Mahito, Himi, Grand Uncle, and the third act's, quote, antagonist, unquote, the Parakeet King. So Grand Uncle offers the role of succession to Mahito by asking him to stack 13 blocks, like building blocks, like children's building blocks, that are free of malice, according to the Grand Uncle, in order to maintain the balance of the world. Mahito rejects this offer by pointing to a wound on his head that he gave himself much earlier in the film in order to avoid going to school. And he tells Grand Uncle that he is unworthy of succession because he possesses malice. And I think this is where here Miyazaki comes to terms with his feelings that Goro never wanted to follow in his father's footsteps, nor does he have any desire to do so anymore as a filmmaker or company leader. And Grand Uncle asks Mahito if he'd rather live in a world of cruelty and suffering than a surreal one of his creation. And Mahito replies with a resounding yes. The literal title of the film in Japan and a big question of the movie is, how do you live? And I think this is Goro Miyazaki's answer, choosing to live. And that's stepping away from Studio Ghibli. And I think the father is fully accepting and encouraging of this in his own way through this film. Even though the world outside of creating works for Studio Ghibli is full of suffering and cruelty, Goro would rather live in that world because it's real and it's something that he can control and have a say in. And it's about living for himself, not living for somebody else, like maintaining his father's legacy throughout the years after Hayao Miyazaki sadly retires and or passes away. And I think another element that will bring about the end of Studio Ghibli once Miyazaki passes is the ever-increasing influence of the Pay Pigs that would take over and wear the name as basically a skin suit. And I think this is represented in the film by the Parakeet King and his mindless, adoring subjects, because these individuals do not care about the preservation of art, beauty, or dignity. And Studio Ghibli is just a brand in their eyes, and if given the opportunity, they will run that name into the ground to chase the almighty dollar. Similar to the Parakeet King and his mindless subjects, these pay pigs just mindlessly cheer, kill, and consume. And Hayao Miyazaki is really smart enough to know this. And fuck, I think he knew this more than 10 years ago in that earlier prophetic statement. And he probably knew that damn well even much further back. Without a talented, smart leader at the helm, he knew Studio Ghibli would someday join the likes of creatively bankrupt product churners like Disney, Star Wars, Marvel, and countless others these days. And this ending is shown in The Boy and the Heron. Having witnessed Granduncle's attempt to pass on the role of master and guardian to Mahito, the Parakeet King storms in and becomes enraged at this perceived betrayal. And what's interesting is that he tries stacking the 13 blocks, and they almost fall over. So enraged, the Parakeet King slices the Granduncle's 13 blocks into pieces. This, of course, triggers a calamitous event that kills both Granduncle and the Parakeet King and marks the destruction of the world. Mahito, his companions, and several creatures escape the collapsing dream world, and Mahito returns to his time as a wiser and more emotionally mature individual. And what's interesting about this ending is that Miyazaki doesn't portray the death and destruction of the dream world, i.e. Studio Ghibli, as anything terrible or negative, but positive and cathartic. Similar to Laputa's destruction at the end of Castle in the Sky, this sequence is complemented by beautiful and uplifting music from the amazing Joe Hisaishi that suggests that the destruction shouldn't be seen as the lamentable end of something wonderful, but the beginning of something new and more fulfilling, more true to oneself. And I think another musical hint that this is meant to be a positive thing is that the main theme, called Ask Me Why, is played in all its full orchestral glory during the moment when Mahito rejects his birthright succession, suggesting that Mahito's development into his own person is complete. In conclusion, I think The Boy and the Heron is basically Miyazaki's way of saying he has no qualms about letting his legacy pass on. He's made his peace with it, and he seems to be saying that we should too. The end shouldn't be seen as a sad occasion, but a joyous one that's worth celebrating. During a time when our pop culture, in my opinion, is obsessed with reliving and recapturing every element of the past, it's refreshing to see someone of Miyazaki's caliber so accepting of letting go and moving on. Hayao Miyazaki holds no malice about the end of Studio Ghibli and its legacy. So, why should we?